Hi and welcome to Big Ideas. I'm Waleed Ali. On the show today, Professor Patrick Dodson giving the inaugural Gandhi oration at the University of New South Wales to an audience where there was standing room only. Dodson's speech was to commemorate the anniversary of Gandhi's assassination on January 30th in 1948 and the Indian leader's pioneering of non-violent struggle and civil disobedience. But Professor Dodson didn't resile from comment about the uproar that blew up when some of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy demonstrators ambushed the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition at a Canberra restaurant.
I should say in my language, Ngaji Gurijan, that is, how are you all? Ngayu Ngilawal Patrick Dodson. My name is Patrick Dodson. Ngayu Ngambulan Yarangan Buru. I come from the Yaru country in the west. I acknowledge the Mendigal and Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, on whose lands we are gathered and on which this fine university is built. I acknowledge the Consul General, Amat Dasgupta, Premier of New South Wales, Barry O'Farrell, Vice-Chancellor and Professor Fred Hilmer, Vice-Chancellor Academic Richard Henry, Neville Roach of the Australian Indian Society, University of New South Wales dignitaries and other distinguished guests. When the Vice-Chancellor Fred Hilmer and Neville Roach generously invited me to deliver this inaugural Mahatma Gandhi oration, I felt not only humbled by the great honour at having been asked to undertake the task, but also apprehensive as to my own ability to do justice to the achievements of a man whose physical well-being left the world on this day 64 years ago, but whose life and achievements have inspired every human rights struggle that has been undertaken on this earth since his death in Delhi in 1948. When one is given the honour of delivering an oration that has been created to honour and recognise great people and their achievements, there is bestowed a great responsibility to not only give just and fair acknowledgement to the work and reputation of the person for whom the oration is named, but to interpret the values, lessons and messages that are the true legacy of that person of greatness that they have bequeathed to us and to later generations. So first, let me acknowledge that I am not an expert on Gandhi or his teachings. There are no doubt many here who are far more familiar with Gandhi's writings and teachings and are better placed to give scholarly interpretation to his work. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence included satyagraha, I hope I've got that right, the removal of tyranny through civil disobedience, and the Swadeshi, the economic boycott of foreign goods. At the same time, he lived by his ideals and ethics and devoted himself to a higher purpose, satya, the search for truth. Mohandas Gandhi did not invent the concept of pacifism, non-cooperation, non-violence and peaceful resistance solely as a weapon to achieve political outcomes. He certainly personified and applied such concepts to an extraordinary level to himself and for the freedom of India. For Gandhi, the essence of non-violence as a technique was to liquidate antagonism, but not the antagonist. He believed such values were essential for the future humankind in a world rebuilding itself after 2 world wars and engaging in the drivers of modernity, that is, global trade and resource exploitation. Like all great thinkers, Gandhi looked at history to help define his philosophy of political struggle. And the great Russian writer, Leo Tolstoy, wrote in his letters to a Hindu in 1908 that he believed that the use of love as a weapon was the only way in which the native Indians would be able to remove the colonial oppression of the British Empire, Gandhi sought his permission to reprint the letter in his native Gujarati language. In Gandhi's words, "I thus began to call the Indian movement Satyagraha, that is to say, the force which is born of truth and love or non-violence." Gandhi never received the Nobel Peace Prize, though he was nominated several times. His contribution to peace, however, is not diminished by the absence of an accolade. Gandhi's legacy to peace endured in the inspiration he gave other great leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Aung San Suu Kyi, all of who were influenced by Gandhi and their own struggles against tyranny and oppression and racism. But what of our experiences with oppression and tyranny in Australia? The Vinegar Hill Rebellion in 1804, the uprisings in the Victorian goldfields in the 1850s, which led to the Eureka Stockade, even Ned Kelly's attempt to set up the Republic of North-Eastern Victoria, all failed because the main avenue chosen was an unequal violence confrontation between government and the oppressed. It is notable that in the most successful challenges to oppression and injustice by Aboriginal people in Northern Australia, the Pilbara strikes in 1946 and the Gurindji people's walk-off from the servitude of the Vesti properties in 1966 had parallels with the non-violent resistance used by Gandhi. In both instances, the strategies used so effectively by Gandhi, the removal of labour, boycott of economic activities and non-violent opposition, were used by leaders to resist attempts by those with power and money to force Aboriginal people back into the cages of oppression and slavery. Vincent Lingiari succeeded with his walk-off where the Bunuba resistance leader, Jundamara, could not with his guerrilla warfare. The spirit of resistance that Jundamara stands for today still burns bright. But in the stand of the Gurindji, we see how the armoury of resistance was adjusted to include non-violent forms of protest. I'm also reminded of the leadership shown by my dear friend Michael Long, a star AFL footballer from the Northern Territory, who embarked on foot from Melbourne to Canberra, seeking an answer from those in political power to the question, where is the love for my people? Michael had sore feet at the end of his 700-kilometre trek, and I'm sure that Gandhi may have had similarly been affected after his long salt march to the sea. There are other examples where Aboriginal people have resisted attempts by the state and others to trample their rights without resorting to violence and the use of brute force. Nookanbar in the Kimberley and the Tent Embassy in Canberra springs to mind. Though recent events in Canberra may have tainted this perception of the Tent Embassy for some. It would be simplistic, however, to condemn outright the behaviour of protesters associated with the Tent Embassy last week, without considering the sense of oppression that some of our people still feel towards our governments on a whole range of matters. I will always condemn bad manners and unnecessarily aggressive behaviour by whomever, but I will also defend people's rights to assert their political position and try to look at the heart of why people feel so oppressed that they feel violent confrontation is the only recourse to the resolution of their position. Each nation's journey is different, and each person's experience within the nation is unique to the truth of their own circumstances. In life's journey, time, circumstances, or fate can take us in many different and unexpected, perhaps disconcerting directions. My own life has taken several directions. Its foundations have often been highly influenced by events over which I had very little control. My parents both died when I was within 3 months of each other, in very tragic ways in the early 1960s. I became a ward of the state and the property of the Native Protector, who, but for the will and struggle of my older sister, would have sent me to a mission home, leaving me cut off from my family, my community and my culture. While in her care, I ran away to go droving with a friend I knew from the Katherine Northern Territory area. But like Gandhi's initial endeavours to establish himself in practice in Bombay, my droving career was short-lived, and a career possibly unsuccessful. I was retrieved from the camp by a family friend, returned to Katherine and sent off to exile in Victoria to a Catholic boarding school for boys at Monterey College in Hamilton on the vast sheep breeding plains that had been named Australis Felix by Major Thomas Mitchell a century before, but which had been the ancestral lands and waters of the Aboriginal people of that region for millennia. It was in Victoria that I learned about difference, race, and the importance of learning. It was here that I gained an understanding of the society which had been overlaid on the domain of the Indigenous society of my own family, and where I became more and more aware of the consequences of government policies. With this learning began an analysis of the future directions and the burden of the opportunities that fate and circumstances had placed before me. The needs of others, as against individual fulfilment, had been well planted in my formation at this point. But on reflection, the tension between what profession to choose in order to meet the physical and the spiritual needs of others, as well as myself, was part of a false binary, with great emphasis on the religious necessities and the practical needs being relegated to a secondary position. I will always be grateful for the education I received at Monterey and to the many lifelong friends it bequeathed to me. The years of further learning and study after leaving Monterey were spent within the constraint and ambivalent embrace of the Catholic Church in the period leading up to my ordination and my work as a practising priest. But like many others who had embarked on a similar journey, I soon found myself at the crossroads, confronting an intersection of political, cultural and religious divergence. The tension between injustice and salvation never seemed to resolve itself successfully. In my mind, there was a need for my people to hear the good news of spiritual redemption, but also the practical liberation of improving their lives for themselves and others through the alleviation of poverty and redressing injustice. I chose the path of political and social activism and sought to underpin the values and principles of my activism with the spirituality and culture of my Aboriginal heritage. This did not mean that charity and good works were not a necessity. I regret that I've never been to India or been a student of its ancient history, religions, traditions, and diverse cultures. Nor have I studied Indian colonial history, its transition to nationhood, or the modern developments that this great nation has been able to achieve. As an Aboriginal child growing up in Katherine in the Northern Territory, India was an exotic place, as distant and far removed from my reality as England was. What little I knew of India, I learnt from social studies and geography lessons at primary school, and from what I saw at the picture shows. Yet when I look back to the India of my boyhood construction, there were some parallels. A history of colonisation by the British, for instance, was something we shared here in Australia. In India, the British presence arrived in the form of the East India Trading Company. In Australia, they arrived by boat to set up a prison. It is perhaps ironic that the ship which first brought the British naval captain James Cook to the eastern shores of this continent in 1770 and began our colonial experience was named the Endeavour. Ever since that April day when the Aboriginal people of Australia, represented by the people of Botany Bay, and the colonising peoples, represented by Cook and his crew, we two peoples have been locked in an endless endeavour. That endeavour to come to terms with each other's place on this continent. The modern Australian nation has, of course, come a long way since then, and we have taken many positive steps together in terms of improving Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. The goodwill and support shown by everyday Australians in our journey towards reconciliation has been a very important part of the gains that we have made. However, as a nation-state, we have not succeeded in achieving a just accommodation of the truth concerning the sovereign Indigenous peoples who occupied this continent prior to the arrival of the British. While it may be convenient for some to want to forget this point, it nevertheless remains that the Australian nation that came into being in 1901 was founded on a historical legacy of colonial dispossession and silence about the presence of Indigenous people. As a nation, we may have the possibility, should we go to a referendum, to address this by recognising the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution of Australia. But even now, in the second decade of the 21st century, full and proper recognition of the status of the Indigenous peoples as the first peoples, with rights and responsibilities that go with that status, is regarded with alarm by some within our country. This is despite the fact that countries like Canada, New Zealand, Norway, demonstrating that it is possible to agree and give substantive recognition to Indigenous peoples without that recognition leading to the downfall of the nation-state. Indigenous Australia has never been recognised as equal people in their own lands. Australian courts have generally ruled that we are subject to the jurisdiction of the settler state. Our own customary laws, which have sustained our societies for millennia, have been set aside and discarded as worthless. The wealth of the nation-state of Australia what it enjoys comes from the exploitation of our lands and waters. The price of this has been our dispossession and displacement and our dependent relationship with the nation-state. Australia is one of the wealthiest nations of the world, yet we seem incapable of lifting the vast majority of Indigenous people in this country to anywhere near parity on any social indicator with non-Indigenous Australians. In the midst of the mining boom, many Aboriginal people are finding immediate relief from the poverty besetting many of our communities by gaining employment in the mining industry. But I question whether in the long term our participation in unbridled exploitation is not in fact adding to the diminishment of our custodial responsibilities to humanity, global sustainability and resilience. It is 20 years since the handing down of the Royal Commission report into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and yet we are still overrepresented in state prisons and institutions. On average, we are dying 10 to 17 years younger or earlier than other Australians. Our national government presents a different face when dealing on the international stage to what it does domestically in their treatment of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this land. And I struggle with this hypocrisy, particularly when they seem happy to intervene in the affairs of other countries, but become very defensive when criticised for their treatment of the first peoples of this land. When I reflected on Gandhi in preparation for this oration, there's something that he said in Hind Swaraj that struck a chord with me. In Hind Swaraj, Home Rule, Gandhi notes that while religious difference and conflict existed before the arrival of the British, Indians did not define themselves solely in terms of this difference. It was British colonialism that formalised division and difference by resetting the foundations of power and civilisation to those based on Western principles of commerce, industrialisation and the rule of law as determined by the empire. India, Gandhi writes in his chapter on the railways, was one nation before the British arrived, an undivided land once connected by the pilgrimage of holy men who spoke each other's languages and paid homage and respect to each other's ancient holy places. This particular description by Gandhi resonated with me. It reminded me how we as diverse Indigenous peoples, from the saltwater to the river, to the desert, to the hills, are connected through ancient songlines that cover our entire continent. Our songlines, the ancient tracks of our ancestors' spirits, created a sense of nation or oneness out of our people who spoke different languages and occupied different landscapes. This, I suggest, was our common law. It was a law system that emanated from what we in the Yaru say, from our Bulgarigara, from the time before time began. A social, religious and legal code that informed our kinship system, predicated our rights and obligations to country and created common bonds and obligations. The nationhood we experience was not of the design of the empire. Despite our highly complex social systems, our customary laws and territorial organisations, we were deemed to lack the polity with a system of property rights that the British could equate with their own. So it was that the land that our ancestors had occupied for thousands of years was declared terra nullius, a land belonging to no one. This legal doctrine prevailed until the High Court overturned it in 1992 in the landmark Mabo case. But our own customary law, which sustained our societies for millennia, remains subjugated to laws of the settler state. Native title claimants must, under this system, abdicate their unique commonality for adjudication by courts and lawyers. Our history has dictated that we, the original owners of this land, must share our country with people from many other lands. We acknowledge this reality, the need to share and recognise the interest of those who have come and now occupy and exploit our lands and waters. Yet this understanding is not always understood, shared or reciprocated. Throughout my own working life, the discourse has usually been about having to conform to some new party policy, a new set of rules, or to be inducted into yet another set of implementation strategies, all authored by outside agencies to lift us out of the dependent state that we find ourselves in after more than 200 years. If there is any parallel with Gandhi to get the empire out of India, it would be the desire to displace the authoritative position of the public service from the lives of the Aboriginal people, so that some of the values that have underlined our society prior to the British occupation might again find useful expression and contribute to our resilience. The opportunity in 1991 for me to chair the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation arose after years of work, along with others, in trying to achieve land rights for our people and to get federal laws to deal with Aboriginal heritage, and to have national representative entities established in the hope of governing our affairs. It was also recommended out of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, in which I was one of the commissioners. A formal process of reconciliation coming soon after the promise of a treaty by the Labor government was seen as an opportunity to improve our relationship. But the divisive debate that followed the High Court decision in the Wick case in 1996 challenged the resolve for reconciliation. In Wick, native title was found to coexist with the grant of a pastoral lease. Yet this recognition of coexistence where the rights of the leaseholder still prevailed was met with a legislative regime under John Howard's 10-point plan that eroded our rights, ensured extinguishment, which is an abhorrent concept in customary Aboriginal law, and made sure that was a feature of the native title. Under the Howard Coalition government, we saw a shift in reconciliation away from what was called the rights agenda towards practical reconciliation. Reconciliation, it seems, was redefined as a provision of practical measures to address discrepancies in the socio-economic status rather than the root causes of our exclusion. Practical short-term measures were to be pursued to achieve assimilation with the mainstream, while dialogue with Aboriginal people about substantive issues of equality were completely disregarded. The polemics of the rights and responsibility discourse were posited as opposing binaries, effectively reducing to a clash competing ideologies what should have been for us a constructive discussion of our collective failures to address the historical inequity and exclusion experienced by Australia's Indigenous peoples and the disadvantage to which this gave rise. I was disheartened when when Aboriginal people when our suffering was politicised and used by those in privileged positions to gain kudos or to score political points in the media. More and more we were being defined in the language of disadvantage and gaps, portrayed in the media as impoverished welfare mendicants, dependency, incapable of uplifting ourselves from a state of disadvantage or social malaise, despite the largesse of the nation-state. There is no doubt in my mind that there is a need to ameliorate disadvantage, reduce welfare dependency and address abuse and the debilitating social problems experienced in Aboriginal communities. I do not disagree with Noel Pearson when he says there is a need for our people to take responsibility and eliminate dependency. But we must avoid false dichotomies around rights and responsibilities and symbolic and practical forms of reconciliation that obstruct the need for a balanced approach. This year I had the privilege of working with an expert panel comprising of Aboriginal people from diverse backgrounds and people of different political persuasions. We were given the task by the Prime Minister to seek to find a way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia to be recognised in the Australian Constitution. Our report was handed to the Prime Minister earlier this month. We have recommended 5 specific changes that would entail the removal of 2 sections and the insertion of 3 sections to the body of the Constitution. Currently, the Australian Constitution, the founding legal document of the Commonwealth of Australia, does not recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were not involved in the discussions about federation, nor were they included in the constitutional conventions that led to the drafting of the Australian Constitution. when the Australian Constitution was passed by Westminster Parliament in 1901, the only two express references to Aboriginal people in the Constitution related to our exclusion. Section 127 excluded us from being counted in the Commonwealth census, while Section 5126 stated that the Commonwealth could make laws for all races other than the Aboriginal race in any state. In 1967, the Australian people voted overwhelmingly to repeal Section 127 altogether and amend Section 5126 to enable the Commonwealth to make laws for the people of any race for whom it was deemed necessary to make special laws. However, Section 25, which gives the states the ability to disenfranchise people on the basis of race, still remains in our Constitution today. Problems still arise with having a race power under Section 5126. The dilemma is that Section 5126, that is in its current form, enables the Commonwealth to pass laws that can adversely affect any group of people by virtue of their race, including Aboriginal peoples. Yet without this head of power, laws such as the Native Title Act could not be passed. The task of recognition was complicated by the fact that preambular recognition, the form of recognition most expected to be put forth, is not as straightforward as originally thought. The challenge before the panel was how to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their unique place in this nation and provide the Commonwealth with the power to pass laws for us without resorting to the outmoded identifier such as race. For this reason, amongst us, the panel proposed a new head of power called Section 51A. This new section would incorporate a statement of recognition similar to a preamble and also gives the Commonwealth Parliament the power to pass laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In this way, if there are legal consequences to the inclusion of a statement of recognition, they would be limited to the new section and not impact other sections of the Constitution. The panel also recommended that a non-discrimination provision, Section 116A, also be inserted in the Constitution. Such a provision provides for formal equality by prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of race, colour, or ethnic or national origin, but still allows Commonwealth and state parliaments to pass laws to address forms of inequality or disadvantage for any group of people, if required. Such special measures could otherwise be referred to as forms of affirmative action. This is not a one-clause Bill of Rights, nor is this proposition something that is radical or new. The Constitution of countries such as Canada, South Africa and India all contain similar non-racial discrimination provisions to that which the panel has proposed. Such a provision would bring us into step with international standards. The expert panel has been criticised for overextending its reach by proposing such a recommendation. There will, of course, be some who argue against and some who will argue in favour of such a provision. No doubt there will be those who reject both constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples altogether and who will regard our task as a waste of time. For some of my own Indigenous peoples, our recommendations will not have gone far enough. For other Australians, it will appear to have gone too far. On this point, I can empathise with Gandhi, who left the second round table of negotiations in London in December 1931, disheartened by the tone and direction of the negotiations. I hope, however, that we as a nation can have an informed and mature conversation about such matters without resorting to division and divisive commentary or cheap political point scoring. Ultimately, to achieve any of these requires a referendum to be conducted that delivers a double majority. That is, a majority of voters and a majority of states. This, of course, comes after the proposition to be put to the voters and the states have been agreed to in a law passed by the Federal Parliament. If there is no cross-party support for the proposition, then it will more than likely fail if pursued. If our politicians cannot agree, then we should not consider a referendum. This is a relatively simple matter of recognition of the first peoples of this land. Whilst this would be belated, if achieved, it would set a new foundation for our future relationship. We'll have to wait and see how politicians and the country deals with this most important challenge for us as a modern nation. Australians generally do believe in justice and tolerance and are not racist, but we are perhaps too accepting of racism and intolerance in our midst. The terrible attacks on the Indian students, the demonising of Muslims and the Cronulla riots tell us how far we still need to go to address racism and intolerance in our society. But the intolerance and racism is something that many Indigenous peoples are confronted with on a daily basis. We feel the hostile judgments by the dominant society whose growing understanding of the past injustice has evaporated under an avalanche of public commentary about the ideological righteousness of blame and individual responsibility, which has had no historical context or analysis. We have seen the demonising of our cultural identity and the ridiculing of our traumatic history by Australian political leaders who label the Indigenous rights agenda as meaningless symbolism that has no positive practical outcome. What we have not seen is an honest dialogue about the impacts of the settler state and its intertwined history with us. What we do see are the consequences of modernity upon our ways, cultures and spiritual values. And this is why a dialogue is essential. I believe that racial discrimination should not be tolerated in our society, and enshrining this in our Constitution would be an act that enhances us all. But intolerance and the death of racism cannot be constructed by legislation alone. To be rid of racism, we must reflect on how we treat and view others who are different to us. This, like true reconciliation, must involve a process of engagement based on mutual respect, trust, and deep understandings and commitments to agreed objectives. Gandhi would no doubt have added that preparing to achieve such a relationship would require personal reflection and spiritual openness to find truth and love through the engagement. As a nation, we have found this almost impossible to contemplate. Several years ago, it became clear to me and some others there was a need to establish a new philosophical basis for the relationship between the settler state and the Aboriginal people, a need for a new dialogue between our peoples. We were seeking a dialogue that would address the needs for tolerance and non-discrimination and respect for diversity in this country. A true dialogue, not a regurgitation of the woes of the settler state, but to establish a new foundation befitting the history, context and challenges of the modern era. So too, in more recent times, Aboriginal people have sought a full and open dialogue about how this nation can incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems and experience into how we are to deal with the damage that has been done to our environment and landscape. Yet even in this most critical of areas, Indigenous peoples are being relegated to the back blocks or the back tables as an afterthought rather than people with vast knowledge and experience in such matters as land and sea management. In traditional Indian culture, Gandhi saw great strength and resilience, but he despaired at the propensity of Western civilization and its ideas of modernity that made people slaves to industrialisation, the pursuit of money and material wealth. This was a civilising intent that hypnotised people and disconnected people from their spirituality and connections to nature. The consequences for Indian peoples of British colonialism and the pervasive spread of commercialised modernity was not lost on Gandhi. For him, the disconnect in the politics of modernity was that the poor became poorer and less resilient as they lost village skills that for centuries had sustained meaningful livelihoods for them, whilst the wealthy champions of modernity became richer and more powerful. One of Gandhi's greatest skills was his ability to expose the inequities of a system that spoke of equality but never delivered it. We should draw from this insight and rethink our approach of development at all costs, driven solely by market imperatives or because it is deemed good for the economy. There is a need for ecological and social balance to be restored, not only to ensure our resilience, but our very survival as human beings. There are many challenges facing this country today, including the future management of our lands and seas, which is overshadowed by global warming and our own past poor management of lands, waters and forests. We are capable of meeting these challenges with our science, technology and imagination. Gandhi's experience shows that while the round table talks or conferences failed, persistence of the issues remained, so that equally the major objective, the independence of the Indian people, would be met. The trademark of the British to divide and conquer and then rule via a restructure of peoples was evident in the lives of Gandhi, who understood well how unified India required respect for diversity. He saw no value in a nationalism that promoted division between Muslim and Hindu. On my reading of Gandhi, assimilation was not about conformity at the expense of one's difference, so that one culture, one cultural order pervades over another. Unity has to be about accommodating difference through dialogue, so that common ground can be found. It is on common ground where we meet as equals on the basis of our difference that we will find unity. When we can achieve a dialogue that results in a just and true reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, then and only then will we be able to say that our nation-building task has been completed. We will have faced our truth, our satya. On this day of martyrs, I'd like to conclude with the words of one who knew the Mahatma better than most, and whose own journey of life was as complex as his friend and companion. On the granting of Indian independence on the 14th of August 1947, Mr. Nehru said, "On this day, our thoughts go to the architect of this freedom, the father of our nation, Gandhi, who, embodying the old spirit of India, held aloft a torch of freedom and lighted up the darkness that surrounded us. We have often been unworthy followers of his and have strayed from his message. But not only we, but succeeding generations will remember this message and bear the imprint on their heart of this great son of India. magnificent in his faith and strength and courage and humility. We shall never allow that torch of freedom to be blown out, however high the wind or stormy the tempest. Kalia.
Thank you, Dr. Dodson. It was really amazing that you use Gandhi's one of the main tools in your speech a few times, which is civil disobedience. If we use this one in a practical manner, I'm sure, and everybody in the House will be agreeing on this one, that we can get a resolution and both the party will resolve to some sort of a conclusion if all the people who are being affected somehow get this thing in their mind, and rather than getting into a situation where only few people sitting in a camera tent embassy, which is not somehow giving a message that all the Aboriginal people are behind it. So civil disobedience, anywhere you go, people are talking about this one, they are doing something, and this tool of Gandhi will certainly help. What is your thought on that?
Well, there are times for all sorts of things. My reading of our political pulse in this country at the moment, and I'm not an expert, is that we've got a tremendous opportunity on all sides of politics at the federal level. It doesn't always come across because the media does what it wants to do with politics. But there's a great deal, I think, of common ground and the recognition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution. And instead of us playing a divisive game and reverting to the tactics of division, we should focus on what is going to bring us closer together and assist the politicians to think through what is the best for the nation, as opposed to how they might respond to a crisis on any one day of the week when it occurs, because we have many of those in various fronts. This is about the nation building of our country. 200 years later, we are now beginning to discuss the recognition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in our Constitution. This is an amazing thing. It's something we as Australians can achieve if we want, because it's in our hands as the voters to make the change and not to allow ourselves to be sidetracked by various activities. Even in Gandhi's life, when there were terrible things happening, people were fighting, people were killing each other, terrible things were taking place, he went on long marches to reassure people of their value, of their worth, and of the need for non-violence as the way to go forward for a unified nation. So it's not always the protest that has to happen. There's dialogue, there's discussion, there's actually the use of the intellect that has to be brought to bear rather than the force of arms or the force of loud voices and agitation. So there are times for protest, there are times for civil disobedience. Gandhi's civil disobedience was against laws, like the monopoly on the salt, a long march for 400 kilometres or so, 400 miles to the sea, to take salt from the sea, to protest against an unjust law. And people were assaulted in the course of that march, but didn't get deterred from the objective of what they were doing. And we as Australians should not be deterred either from the process of reconciliation, the process of building our nation, and the process of putting ourselves in a global environment where we will be able to stand with some pride and dignity, having dealt with the recognition of the Indigenous peoples of these lands.
I'd also like to pay my respect to Professor Dodson. I'm actually a Gandhian, and my father walked with Gandhiji, so I feel very proud to be here. I'm a community physician working in Western Sydney, and I work with the Indigenous community there. And I'd like to just ask a question, which the community have said to me, that governments listen to organizations and talk to organizations. They rarely talk to the Indigenous community and listen to the people. How can we change that, please?
Look, I've never aspired to be a politician, precisely because it's difficult. And I'm conscious that we've got the Premier of the state here listening to this. But that doesn't daunt me from what I want to say. But I think the fact that we have a very important politician, the most important politician in this state, in this room, is an example of trying to listen to what the people say. And I know there are other members of Parliament here as well. It's always frustrating when you're in the community and you feel you're overlooked and you feel your voice isn't being heard, or you feel what you've had to say is reformulated in a way that you can't even see any reflection of what you were talking about. I think, in the main, communities have it's in their power. If we believe sovereignty is in the hands of the Australian people, then it's in those communities. And those communities have got a right to have their voice heard by their legal representatives. And they have to organise to call the representatives to come and talk to them. And if they don't, you use the media and other people to say you issued these invitations, this particular politician is not turning up. And then if they don't turn up, we use the ballot post and we vote them out in a peaceful way. But I know that sounds easy, and I'm not trying to make light of the concerns that people bring to you. But that's our formal process, and we're very lucky we have a democracy that operates that way. We're very lucky that we have that, and it's something we shouldn't take for granted. But it's the quality of our own organised voice that will improve the quality of the legal and the political representation. Otherwise, they will listen to those who have money, who've got power, who can get through the doors and push and cajole them. Because I learned a lesson from sitting down with Aboriginal people and with mining executives. When they came to introduce themselves, the mining executives talked about how much wealth they had under their belt, what the market share was, how much green fields they were going to invest in. When the Aboriginal people came to speak, they just talked about their kids, their country, and the significance of their relationships. So there's a disconnect often. And the politicians, I think, sometimes are caught in their own space. Whilst they may be keen to do the things, they by people who set some priorities for them that they have to meet. So I have a lot of empathy for them, but I would never join them. Thank you.